Colorado River water deliveries could face cuts as high as 40% for Arizona, California, and Nevada, a reduction measured not in buckets, but in millions of acre-feet. This is not just another drought headline. This river supports cities, farms, power grids, tribal nations, suburbs, food supply chains, and desert economies built around the assumption that the water would keep arriving. The unusual part is not simply that reservoirs are low, it is that the system is being forced to decide who loses water first, who is legally protected, and who discovers that growth was financed with a promise the river can no longer keep. Federal planning has included cuts of up to 3 million acre-feet a year, enough water for millions of households. But that is not the scariest part. The real danger is not only the water disappearing, it is the legal machinery that decides scarcity by seniority, contracts, compacts, court rulings, and old assumptions written for a wetter world. So what happens when a climate-stressed river collides with a century-old legal order? And what does that collision reveal about the future of infrastructure everywhere? Like, subscribe, and comment where you are watching from, because this story is about much more than one river. Stand at Lake Mead, and the first thing you notice is not the water. It is the missing water. It is the pale mineral ring wrapped around the rock walls, a bathtub mark so large it looks less like a stain and more like an accusation. The old waterline sits high above the present surface, marking the level where people once believed the reservoir belonged. Boats, docks, intake towers, ramps, canyon walls, everything around the lake seems to point upward, toward a memory. That image is where this story begins. But the crisis does not stay at the lake. Water leaves the Colorado River through dams, canals, tunnels, pumping stations, irrigation districts, tribal lands, desert cities, and international obligations. It moves into taps in Las Vegas, neighborhoods in Phoenix, farms in Yuma, fields in the Imperial Valley, suburbs outside Los Angeles, power turbines at Hoover Dam and Glen Canyon Dam, and communities whose names almost never appear in national headlines. The Colorado River is not a scenic line on a map. It is a working machine. It supplies water to 7 U.S. states and parts of Mexico. It supports hydropower, agriculture, municipal water systems, recreation, wildlife habitat, and tribal nations. The Bureau of Reclamation says between 35 and 40 million people rely on Colorado River water for at least part of their municipal supply, while agriculture depends on about 70% of the river's water. That is why a proposed cut is not just a cut. It is a stress test. And stress tests reveal the parts of a system that were already weak. For a homeowner in a desert city, the first sign of crisis may not be an empty faucet. It may be a higher water bill, tighter landscaping restrictions, fewer lawns, new building rules, or a city council meeting where officials discuss whether future growth can still be approved. For a farmer, the sign may be more direct. An irrigation district receives less water, land is temporarily fallowed, crops change, debt rises, or an operation built over generations becomes impossible to run in the same way. For a tribal nation, the crisis can be even more complicated. A tribe may hold senior water rights on paper and still lack the pipes, canals, treatment plants, and capital needed to fully use that water. Rights exist in law, water access exists in infrastructure. Those are not the same thing. For a seasonal farm worker, the crisis may not appear as a legal document at all. It may appear as fewer days of work, a smaller paycheck, a field left unplanted, or a town where the economy quietly contracts because water moved somewhere else. This is why the phrase 40% cut can mislead if we hear it too simply. It makes the crisis sound like a uniform percentage applied evenly across a spreadsheet. But water shortage does not behave that way. It travels through power. Some users have stronger legal claims, some have older rights, some have more political influence, some have expensive infrastructure, some have backup supplies, some have groundwater beneath them, some do not. Some cities can pay for conservation, reuse, storage, and treatment. Some rural communities cannot. Some farms grow crops that can be shifted or compensated. Some are tied to land, debt, equipment, labor, and markets that do not change easily. Scarcity is physical, distribution is political, survival is infrastructural. That is the first hidden fact of the Colorado River crisis. The water may be shrinking across a basin, but the pain will not be spread evenly across that basin. The official warning is not vague. The the federal government is in the process of replacing the current operating rules for Lake Powell and Lake Mead. The Bureau of Reclamation describes the post-2026 process as a multi-year effort to determine operations for those two reservoirs and related water management actions for potentially decades into the future. That phrase, decades into the future, matters. This is not only about one bad runoff year. It is not only about one dry winter. It is about the operating system of the river. It is about the rules that decide how much water leaves Lake Powell, how much is held back, how Lake Mead is protected, how shortages are declared, and how the lower basin states absorb cuts when there is not enough water to satisfy the old expectations. The Colorado River has always been engineered. Dams turned seasonal flows into stored supply. Canals carried mountain snowmelt into deserts. Power lines turned falling water into electricity. Contracts turned moving water into bankable growth. Real estate developments, industrial parks, subdivisions, farms and cities all leaned on one promise: the system could deliver. But now the system is being asked a question it was not designed to answer comfortably. What happens when there is less river than law? The answer begins in the reservoirs. Lake Powell and Lake Mead are often described as water savings accounts. In wet years, they store surplus. In dry years, they release water. That is the basic promise of a reservoir. It turns time into supply. It lets one year borrow from another. But a savings account only protects you if deposits eventually return. If withdrawals continue and deposits weaken, the account stops feeling like insurance. It becomes a countdown. The Bureau of Reclamation has warned that long-term drought has reduced Colorado River system storage to about 36% of capacity, while record-low snowpack and record-breaking March heat intensified drought conditions across the basin. The agency also warned that these conditions create elevated risks to essential water and power infrastructure serving more than 40 million people. That is the official language. But underneath it is a more disturbing image. The American West has built one of the most complex water civilizations on Earth, around a river that no longer behaves like the river imagined by its legal architecture. And that matters far beyond the Southwest. Because Colorado River water is not only local water, it is national food, national energy, national migration, national land value, national climate adaptation. Lettuce, hay, cattle feed, winter vegetables, electricity, subdivisions, warehouses, golf courses, semiconductor dreams, data infrastructure, tourism, parks, tribal sovereignty, endangered species, and international diplomacy all meet inside the same hydrologic box. When that box shrinks, it does not shrink politely. It forces choices. And the most dangerous choices are not always the ones announced in press releases. Sometimes they are hidden in the order of priority. In the age of abundance, legal priority feels abstract. In the age of shortage, it becomes a blade. That is why this story cannot be told as a simple drought story. A drought story says, the sky did not give enough water. A climate story says, heat, snow, soil, and evaporation are changing the river's behavior. A legal story says, the old rules decide who absorbs the new reality. A system story says, all three are now colliding. The Colorado River crisis is that collision. The people affected include city dwellers who may never see the river, farmers whose ditches are older than many suburbs, tribal nations whose rights were ignored or delayed for generations, power customers connected to hydropower they barely think about, and communities in Mexico and the river delta that sit at the end of a system where water can be promised many times before it arrives. The visible crisis is low water. The deeper crisis is that a whole region must now decide whether its laws, infrastructure, crops, cities, and expectations can be adjusted fast enough to match a hotter and more uncertain river. Because the river is not negotiating, the river is responding to physics. And physics does not care who signed first. To understand the scale of the proposed cuts, we have to slow down around one strange unit, the acre-foot. An acre-foot is the amount of water needed to cover 1 acre of land 1 foot deep. It sounds technical because it comes from land and irrigation, not from kitchen sinks, but it is one of the basic units of Western water management. Farmers, irrigation districts, reservoir operators, lawyers, and agencies Use it because the Colorado River is not managed cup by cup. It is managed field by field, reservoir by reservoir, contract by contract. 1 acre-foot is about 325,851 gallons. That is already a large number. But the proposed cuts being discussed are not 1 acre-foot. They are not 1,000 acre-feet. They are not even 100,000 acre-feet. They could reach 3 million acre-feet every year. Reuters reported that a federal proposal could cut up to 40% of current supplies to Arizona, California, and Nevada, with reductions of up to 3 million acre-feet annually, enough water for about 6 to 9 million households per year. Pause on that. 6 to 9 million households. That is not a neighborhood cutting back on sprinklers. That is not a city cancelling a few new golf courses. That is a volume of water large enough to make the crisis legible from space. It is the kind of number that tells you the problem has moved beyond conservation slogans and into the machinery of regional survival. But the headline can still mislead. A 40% cut does not mean every person in Arizona, California, and Nevada wakes up to 40% less water from the tap. It does not mean the same percentage falls on every farm, every city, every tribe, every district, and every canal. That is the key. The number is real as a planning scale, but the damage is filtered through law. If the river were a household budget, 3 million acre-feet would be the moment when a family stops talking about skipping dessert and starts talking about selling the car, cancelling insurance, delaying repairs, and deciding which bills get paid first. Small savings are no longer enough. The structure of obligation becomes the issue. And that is why the number hits so hard. It is not only a measure of hydrology, it is a measure of how far the river has moved away from the assumptions built around it. For decades, many Western water conversations were built around efficiency. Use less, line canals, reduce leaks, change landscaping, pay farmers to conserve, reuse wastewater, store more in wet years, build smarter cities. All of that matters. But a 3 million acre-foot annual reduction asks a different question. It asks whether the system can shrink demand at the scale of an entire regional economy. Think of a city. A city can remove grass, it can change building codes, it can recycle indoor water, it can restrict ornamental turf, it can charge more for excessive use. Las Vegas, for example, has become famous for aggressive conservation and removing non-functional grass, showing that urban use can decline even as population grows. But cities are only one part of the river. Agriculture is another. And agriculture is where much of the water goes. The Bureau of Reclamation says agricultural uses depend on about 70% of Colorado River water. That does not mean farmers are villains. It means food production, feed crops, irrigation infrastructure, rural economies, and water rights are central to the math. A desert farm is not just a field. It is a legal entitlement, a set of canals, equipment loans, labor networks, crop contracts, regional identity, and sometimes a century of family history. When water is cut, the field is where the abstract becomes visible. A crop does not care about a compact. It needs water at the root zone. A canal does not care about a press conference. It carries what it carries. A farm worker does not get paid by the acre-foot. They get paid when there is work. That is why the biggest number in this story is not merely 40%. The bigger number is the gap between the amount of water the system was built to use and the amount of water the river can reliably supply. That gap is the true shock. The Colorado River Basin has lived for years with a deficit hidden by reservoirs. Lake Mead and Lake Powell acted like shock absorbers. When inflows were low, stored water kept deliveries moving. When politics stalled, reservoirs bought time. When the basin used more than came in, the lakes absorbed the imbalance. But every shock absorber has a limit. At first, a falling reservoir looks like a manageable problem. The marina moves, the ramp extends, the intake is modified, the operating guideline is adjusted, a temporary agreement is signed, a conservation program is funded, a shortage tier is triggered. The language remains administrative because institutions are designed to make crisis sound procedural. Then one day, the number gets too large to hide. 3 million acre-feet a year is that kind of number. It does not tell us that the river is gone. It tells us that the old flexibility is disappearing. It tells us that temporary shortage is becoming a permanent design condition. It tells us that the system is no longer deciding whether to conserve, it is deciding how to allocate loss. And allocation is where the bomb is buried. Because if the shortage were shared equally, the story would be painful but simple. Every user takes a proportional reduction, every sector adjusts, every state contributes, every city and farm and district gives up the same percentage. But the Colorado River was not built that way. It was built through compacts, federal laws, court decrees, contracts, treaties, priority systems, infrastructure, and political bargains. It was built in layers, and those layers do not disappear just because the climate changes. In fact, when the climate changes, those layers matter more. A number this large does not just measure drought. It measures the failure of an old assumption. The old assumption was that the river could be divided, engineered, stored, and promised in volumes that would remain politically and physically workable over time. The new reality is more unstable. Snowpack can be weaker. Heat can arrive early. Soil can absorb more runoff before it reaches streams. Reservoirs can fall into dangerous operating zones. Demand can remain stubborn. Legal rights can remain rigid. When these things happen together, the number becomes more than a statistic. It becomes a mirror. It shows what happens when a region treats water as both a physical resource and a legal property, but the physical resource begins to shrink faster than the legal property can adapt. This is why the proposed cuts are so disturbing. Not because every worst-case detail is guaranteed, not because every tap is about to run dry, not because the Southwest has no tools. The disturbance comes from scale. If a system needs to consider cuts this large to protect itself, then the problem is not at the edge of the system, it is at the center. And the center is not only the river. It is the promise attached to the river. The most important sentence in this story is not, "The Colorado River is running out of water." That sentence is dramatic. It is also too simple. The more accurate sentence is this: "The Colorado River is running into the limits of a legal system built around more water than the river can reliably provide." That sounds less cinematic, but it is far more dangerous. Because when water is abundant, water law can seem invisible. It sits in files, maps, contracts, court decisions, old agreements, district boundaries, and state offices. Most people do not think about it. They turn on the tap. They buy lettuce in winter. They drive past subdivisions in the desert. They see fountains in casino corridors. They see alfalfa fields under the sun. They see a functioning world. But when water becomes scarce, the law stops being background. It becomes destiny. The Bureau of Reclamation describes the law of the river as a collection of compacts, federal laws, court decisions and decrees, contracts, and regulatory guidelines that apportion and regulate the Colorado River among the 7 basin states and Mexico. That definition matters because it prevents a common misunderstanding. There is not one magic document that controls the river. There is no single switch called Colorado River law. Instead, there is a layered legal architecture built over more than a century that tells different users what they can claim, when they can claim it, under what conditions, and with what priority. The river is physical. The system around it is legal. And now the two are pulling apart. The hidden mechanism is called priority. In much of the West, water rights developed around the doctrine of prior appropriation, often summarized as first in time, first in right. In simple terms, older rights can have stronger claims than newer rights. The details vary by state, contract, district, federal law, treaty, and court ruling, but the basic idea is crucial. When water is short, the question is not always who needs water most today. The question may be, who has the older or more secure legal claim? That is where the moral tension begins. A city may have millions of people. A farm district may have older rights. A tribe may have senior rights but insufficient infrastructure. A rapidly growing suburb may have demand but not priority. A canal may be legally junior even if it serves a modern metropolis. A crop may be economically valuable but politically vulnerable. A river ecosystem may need water but have no voice unless law gives it one. So when someone says, "cut water," the immediate question must be, cut whose water? That question is the real bomb. Not because law is evil. Law is how societies organize scarcity. Without law, every shortage becomes a fight. But a legal system is only as stable as the physical assumptions beneath it. If the assumptions change, the law can begin to distribute pain in ways that feel irrational, unfair, or politically explosive. In the lower basin, this tension is especially sharp. Arizona, California, and Nevada all depend on Colorado River water, but they do not stand in the same legal position. California has historically held senior and powerful claims. Arizona's Central Arizona Project, the canal system that carries Colorado River water deep into central Arizona, has more vulnerable priority in key shortage scenarios. Reuters reported that the federal proposal would follow the law of the river and could favor California because of seniority, while Arizona's Central Arizona Project could face drastic consequences under severe cuts. That single fact changes the story, because from a distance, the Colorado River crisis looks like a shortage problem. Up close, it becomes a hierarchy problem. Imagine two houses on the same street during a blackout. One loses power because it was physically harder to serve. The other keeps power because it signed a contract a century ago. That analogy is imperfect, but it captures the feeling. The crisis is not only who needs service, it is how historical claims decide modern vulnerability. Now, apply that to water. Arizona's cities did not grow by accident. Phoenix did not become a major metropolitan region because people forgot the desert existed. It grew through infrastructure, groundwater, imported water, legal planning, engineering, air conditioning, real estate, and political confidence. The Central Arizona Project was one of the great water delivery systems of the modern West. It made growth possible by moving Colorado River water across the desert. But infrastructure can move water only if law allows the water to move. A canal without a secure supply is a concrete promise waiting for a hydrologic answer. California's Imperial Valley tells a different version of the same story. It is one of the most productive agricultural regions in the country, made possible by Colorado River irrigation. Its rights are old and powerful. Its fields can look almost impossible from the air, green geometry carved into desert. But those fields are not just scenery. They are food, jobs, export value, feed crops, political power, and legal seniority. To some viewers, that may feel unfair. Why should older agricultural rights have stronger protection than newer urban growth? To others, the question cuts the other way. Why should farmers who built communities around legally recognized rights surrender water because cities expanded later? There is no easy answer, because the system was never designed for an easy moment. It was designed for development. It was designed to settle claims, build dams, move water, grow farms, power cities, and prevent open conflict among states. For much of the 20th century, the great problem was how to use the river. Now the problem is how to use less of it without tearing the system apart. That is a different civilization. And this is where the phrase, legal water rights are the real bomb, becomes literal. A bomb is not dangerous only because of explosive material. It is dangerous because of timing, pressure, and containment. The Colorado River's legal system contains many pressures: state versus state, old rights versus new growth, agriculture versus cities, tribes versus delayed recognition, upper basin versus lower basin, U.S., obligations versus Mexico, hydropower versus reservoir storage, ecosystem needs versus human demand. As long as the river delivered enough water, those pressures could be managed. But scarcity compresses them. It pushes every dispute closer together. This does not mean the law of the river should simply be thrown away. That would be naive. Legal certainty is part of how water users plan, invest, grow food, issue bonds, run cities, and avoid chaos. But legal certainty can become brittle if it refuses to acknowledge physical change. A brittle system does not fail because nothing holds it together. It fails because what holds it together cannot bend. That is the danger now. The Colorado River crisis is not just a climate crisis. It is a collision between climate variability, warming, overuse, reservoir depletion, and legal rigidity. Each piece alone would be difficult. Together, they create a squeeze. The old legal world says, "These are the rights." The new physical world says, "Here is the water." And the distance between those two sentences is growing. When water is plentiful, priority can be a technical detail. when water is scarce, priority becomes a social order. That is the part most headlines miss. They show the falling lake. They show the dry boat ramps. They show cracked mud, exposed rock, and shrinking blue shapes on satellite maps. Those images matter, but the deeper image is invisible. A paper river running larger than the real one. One river flows through canyons. The other flows through contracts. For a long time, the West behaved as if those two rivers were the same size. They are not anymore. The mechanism at the center of this crisis needs a name. Call it the hydro-legal squeeze. Hydro, because the physical river is under pressure. Snowpack, runoff, heat, soil moisture, evaporation, reservoir storage. Legal, because the claims on the river are organized through rights, contracts, compacts, decrees, operating rules, and political agreements. Squeeze, because the space between those two systems is narrowing. The river is shrinking in water, but the crisis is expanding through law. To understand the squeeze, start in the mountains. Much of the Colorado River begins as snow. Winter storms deposit water in the Rockies and surrounding high country. In a colder, more stable climate, snowpack acts like a natural reservoir. It stores water through winter and releases it during spring and early summer as meltwater runs into streams, then rivers, then reservoirs. That slow release is essential. It is not just how much precipitation falls. It is when it falls, whether it falls as snow or rain, how long snow remains on the ground, how dry the soil is when melt begins, how hot the air becomes, how much water plants pull from the landscape, and how much evaporates before reaching the main river. A wet winter can still disappoint if heat arrives early. A decent snowpack can still produce weak runoff if soils are dry. A storm can look impressive in the mountains and still fail to refill reservoirs if the basin is thirsty before the river even forms. That is why modern drought in the Colorado River Basin is not simply less rain. Scientists increasingly describe the problem as aridification, a longer-term drying process driven not only by precipitation deficits, but also by warming. Udall and Overpeck's 2017 research found that between 2000 and 2014, Colorado river flows averaged 19% below the 1,906-1,999 average, and that roughly one-third of the flow loss was due to higher temperatures common in the basin. That finding is central because heat changes the meaning of drought. In an old drought, the sky withholds water. In a hot drought, the sky may withhold water while the atmosphere also demands more of what remains. Heat is like an invisible pump. It pulls moisture from soil, plants, snow, and open water. It makes the landscape drink before the river can. It turns the basin into a sponge. Now follow that water downstream. When runoff reaches Lake Powell, the reservoir becomes the first major accounting chamber in the modern Colorado River system. Lake Powell stores upper basin water behind Glen Canyon Dam. Releases from Lake Powell then move toward Lake Mead, the great lower basin reservoir behind Hoover Dam. Together, Lake Powell and Lake Mead are the two largest reservoirs in the United States and the core shock absorbers of the river system. But the shock absorbers are worn down. The Bureau of Reclamation has said long-term drought reduced total Colorado River system storage to about 36% of capacity, while record-low snowpack and record-breaking March heat-intensified drought conditions. That number matters because reservoirs are not only water storage, they are political storage. They store compromise. When reservoirs are full, states can argue while water keeps flowing, cities can grow while negotiations continue, farmers can plant while lawyers debate, agencies can delay hard decisions because the lakes absorb the delay. But low reservoirs remove that luxury. When Lake Powell approaches critical elevations, the issue is not just water supply. It is power generation, dam operations, downstream releases, infrastructure risk, and legal obligation. When Lake Mead falls, shortage tiers activate, deliveries are reduced, hydropower output can decline, intake structures can become harder to operate, recreational economies suffer. The bathtub ring climbs higher above the surface, like a public record of every avoided decision. This is the hydro side of the squeeze. Now add the legal side. The Colorado River is not an open commons where everyone simply takes less when the river runs low. It is governed through the law of the river, the layered structure of compacts, federal laws, court decisions, decrees, contracts, and operating rules. That structure was built to divide and manage the river, but division assumes something to divide. When the physical supply falls below the legal and political demand, the structure begins to tighten. Here is the loop. A dry, warm year reduces snowpack. Early heat accelerates melt. Dry soils and thirsty vegetation absorb more water. Runoff into Lake Powell weakens. Lake Powell must hold more water to protect hydropower and dam operations. Less water moves downstream toward Lake Mead. Lake Mead faces lower levels. Lower basin users face larger cuts. Those cuts are not distributed evenly because legal priority matters. Political pressure rises. States negotiate emergency agreements, temporary conservation programs, and new operating proposals. Those measures may buy time. But if the baseline is shifting, buying time is not the same as solving the mismatch. That is the hydro-legal squeeze. It is not one event. It is a feedback loop between a hotter basin and a rigid allocation system. Picture a theatre with 1,000 tickets sold. For years, the building had 1,000 seats, and even when some rows were broken, managers could rearrange people. Then the building slowly shrank to 800 seats. But the ticket contracts remained. Some ticket holders had premium legal status. Some had old claims, some had new claims. Some had been promised seats but never got accessible entrances. Some depended on the theatre for income. Some sold food outside. Some cities built hotels nearby because the theatre was supposed to stay open. The crisis is not only that there are fewer seats. The crisis is that the old ticketing system still expects the old building. That is the Colorado River. The physical river is the building, the legal river is the ticket list. The reservoirs are the lobby where everyone waits, hoping the mismatch can be managed. But the lobby is filling with tension. This is why a single wet year cannot erase the problem. A wet year can help. Snow can restore storage. Rain can ease pressure. Conservation can slow decline. But the system problem remains if long-term demand, legal claims, and infrastructure expectations continue to exceed what the river can reliably supply under a warming climate. And this is why a single technological fix cannot easily solve it. Desalination may help some coastal areas, but it is expensive, energy-intensive, slow to build, and geographically limited. It does not put mountain snow back into the Rockies. Importing water from far away creates new political, ecological, and engineering problems. Groundwater pumping can cushion shortages temporarily, but aquifers are not magic vaults. Reuse and recycling help cities, but they do not erase the agricultural scale of the basin. Efficiency helps, but in a fully allocated system, saved water must be carefully governed or it simply becomes new demand. The Colorado River problem is not the absence of tools. It is the scale, timing, and governance of those tools. That is why the proposed cuts feel so severe. They are not just use less water. They are an attempt to force the legal river closer to the physical river. And that is painful because the legal river has already built lives. It built farms in deserts. It built canals across empty land. It built subdivisions where rainfall alone could never support millions. It built expectations in bond markets, zoning plans, crop choices, land values, and family decisions. It built a world. Now the real river is asking that world to shrink or transform. This is where the story becomes bigger than the Colorado River. Many modern systems were built under assumptions of stationarity, the idea that natural conditions fluctuate within a familiar range. Engineers could look backward to estimate future floods, droughts, temperatures, and water supplies. Planners could use historic records to design reservoirs, bridges, neighborhoods, insurance maps, and power systems. But climate change weakens that habit. The past still matters, but it is no longer a complete guide. In the Colorado River Basin, the mismatch is especially visible because the river is so heavily measured and allocated. Every acre-foot has a destination. Every reservoir elevation has meaning. Every shortage tier triggers consequences. Every change in runoff becomes a legal and political event. That makes the Colorado River a warning signal. Not because it is the only stressed river, but because it shows, in unusually clear form, what happens when a physical system leaves the range assumed by a human system. The hydro-legal squeeze has four parts. First, the climate side. Warming increases water loss and makes drought more damaging. Second, the infrastructure side. Reservoirs and dams lose flexibility as water levels fall. Third, the legal side. Rights and obligations remain difficult to change. Fourth, the social side. Cuts land on people and communities unevenly. Leave out any one of those parts, and the story becomes false. Only talk about climate, and you miss law. Only talk about law, and you miss heat. Only talk about reservoirs, and you miss people. Only talk about people, and you miss the machinery deciding who gets water. The terrifying part is that no single actor has to be irrational for the whole system to become unstable. A farmer can rationally protect a legal right. A city can rationally secure water for residents. A tribe can rationally demand recognition and infrastructure. A state can rationally defend its allocation. A federal agency can rationally protect critical reservoir elevations. A developer can rationally seek permits under existing rules. A household can rationally move to a cheaper suburb. Each decision can make sense alone. Together, they can overrun the river. That is systems risk. It does not look like a villain turning a valve. It looks like many reasonable decisions accumulating inside a shrinking physical boundary. And that is why the Colorado River feels haunted. The old system is still operating, water still flows, crops still grow, cities still function, tourists still visit the Grand Canyon, power still comes through the grid. The crisis has not become total collapse. That is exactly why it is dangerous. Systems often look functional until the buffer is gone. The buffer was the reservoirs. The buffer was legal delay. The buffer was the belief that next year might fix this year. The hydro-legal squeeze is the moment when those buffers stop being enough. And once that happens, the question changes. It is no longer, how do we survive this drought? It becomes, how do we govern a river that may no longer return to the old normal? The Colorado River crisis did not begin with one dry winter. It began with an old confidence. In the early 20th century, the American West looked at the Colorado River and saw a future. Engineers saw dams, farmers saw irrigation, cities saw growth, politicians saw development. The desert, to them, was not a warning. It was a challenge to be conquered by concrete, law, and ambition. The Colorado River Compact and the legal architecture that followed were designed to prevent conflict and enable development. They divided the river among states and later worked alongside treaties, court decisions, federal laws, contracts, and operating guidelines. That architecture made the modern Southwest possible. But it rested on an assumption: the river would be large enough. That assumption has always been contested. Historical records now show that early 20th century flow estimates were overly optimistic compared with longer-term averages. The compact era did not perfectly represent the long-term river. In simple terms, the system was built during a period when the river looked more generous than it really was. That is not a minor footnote. It is the original crack. A legal system can divide water only if the water exists. If the paper river is larger than the physical river, conflict is built in from the start. Reservoirs can delay the reckoning. Engineering can move water efficiently. Conservation can reduce waste. But if the underlying allocation is too large, the system eventually returns to the same question: who takes less? For decades, Lake Mead and Lake Powell softened that question. They were enormous. They looked permanent. They gave the region confidence that the river could be managed through storage. Lake Mead, formed by Hoover Dam, became an icon of American engineering. Lake Powell, formed by Glen Canyon Dam, became another massive bank of stored water upstream. Together, they allowed managers to smooth wet and dry years, generate hydropower, and maintain deliveries. They were not only reservoirs, they were psychological infrastructure. As long as they held enough water, the system could believe in itself. That is the danger of a buffer. A buffer protects you, but it can also hide the speed of decline. The reservoirs did not fail all at once. They did something more dangerous. They made the shortage look manageable until it was not. A falling lake is not automatically a catastrophe. Reservoirs rise and fall. That is what they are designed to do. But when a reservoir falls for years under pressure from overuse, drought, and warming, the decline becomes a message. It says the old balancing tools are no longer balancing. The Bureau of Reclamation has warned that Colorado River system storage has fallen to about 36% of capacity, with record low snowpack and extreme March heat intensifying basin-wide drought. That is not ancient history. That is the operating environment now. And it gives the old compact a new meaning. In a wetter or more stable climate, the law of the river could function as a settlement architecture. It told states and users how to share a valuable resource. But in a hotter and drier era, the same architecture can become a conflict architecture. Every clause becomes more important, every priority becomes more consequential, every ambiguity becomes more dangerous. The past matters here because it proves the crisis is not imaginary. The basin has already lived through emergency agreements, shortage declarations, drought contingency plans, conservation deals, and federal interventions. None of these were meaningless. They helped. They bought time. They protected reservoir elevations. They reduced use in specific periods. They showed that cooperation is possible. But temporary deals are not the same as structural balance. A family can survive by drawing down savings for a while. A city can survive by delaying maintenance for a while. A reservoir system can survive by using stored water for a while. But for a while is the key phrase. If the income does not recover, the savings run out. The Colorado River's income is runoff. And runoff is changing. Reuters reported that runoff into Lake Powell was projected to be extremely low after historically weak snowpack, with April through July snowmelt runoff forecast at just 13% of average, the lowest since Lake Powell was created. That kind of year is not just bad luck, it is a glimpse of the operating risk. A warm, dry winter, early melt, low inflow, reservoir protection measures, reduced releases, pressure on downstream users, political conflict. Then the same debate returns: who cuts, how much, and under what authority. The historical comparison is uncomfortable because it shows that the West did not merely make a mistake once. It built an entire civilization around a river that was always variable, then made that civilization more vulnerable by assuming engineering could make variability manageable forever. This is not a story about foolish people in the past. It is a story about institutions doing what institutions often do, converting uncertainty into documents. A compact feels solid, a dam feels solid, a canal feels solid, a water right feels solid, a subdivision map feels solid, a crop contract feels solid. But all of them rest on moving water, and moving water is not solid. The Colorado River Compact belongs to an era when the main question was how to divide and develop the river. The emerging question is how to contract and adapt without triggering legal, economic, and social fracture. That is a much harder question. Development produces winners. Contraction produces conflict among people who already built lives around the old arrangement. A farmer with senior rights may see calls for cuts as an attack on property, history, and livelihood. A city with junior supply may see strict priority as a threat to millions of residents. A tribe may see both sides arguing over water, while tribal rights, infrastructure, and sovereignty remain unresolved. An environmental advocate may see the entire debate as human users fighting over a river that also needs water to remain a river. Each perspective contains truth. That is what makes the crisis hard. If the problem was simply waste, the solution would be efficiency. If the problem was simply drought, the solution would be waiting for rain. If the problem was simply law, the solution would be rewriting agreements. But the problem is all of these things at once. The old compact did not create climate change, it did not create every modern demand, it did not force every city to grow, it did not choose every crop, but it did create a framework in which the river could be promised, and that framework now confronts a physical reality harsher than the one it assumed. The warning from history is not that law is useless. The warning is that law must remain connected to the world it governs. When that connection weakens, people may continue to act legally while the system becomes physically impossible. That is one of the most important lessons of the Colorado River. A system can be lawful and unsustainable at the same time. The American West is not the first place to learn this. Irrigated civilizations have always depended on a delicate relationship between water, power, and social order. Mesopotamia, the Nile, the Indus, Central Asia, California's Central Valley, the Murray-Darling Basin in Australia each tells a version of the same story. Water infrastructure creates abundance. Abundance creates growth. Growth creates dependence. Dependence hardens into politics. Then climate variability, or overuse, reveals the fragility beneath the achievement. The Colorado River is a modern version of that ancient pattern. Only now the dams are bigger, the cities are larger, the legal documents are more complex, the power grids are interconnected, the food systems are national, and the climate is warming because of human activity. That makes the historical lesson sharper. The past is not repeating exactly, it is scaling up. Lake Mead and Lake Powell were built to manage extremes, but they were not built to make a permanently smaller river behave like a larger one. That is the boundary now becoming visible. And once you see that boundary, the crisis changes shape. The question is no longer whether the Colorado River system can survive one more emergency agreement. It probably can. The question is whether emergency agreements are becoming the new form of governance. If every few years the basin must invent temporary reductions, emergency releases, new conservation payments, modified operations, and legal workarounds, then the emergency is no longer temporary. It has become the system. That is what makes this moment historic. Not that the river is low. The river has been low before. Not that states are arguing. States have argued before. Not that drought is painful. Drought has always been painful. What is different is that the old physical assumptions, the old legal allocations, the old reservoir buffer, and the old development model are all being tested at the same time. A century ago, the West asked, "How much can we build with this river?" Now the river is asking back, how much of what you built can survive the river that actually exists? Every water crisis has a visible map and an invisible map. The visible map shows reservoirs, canals, state borders, irrigation districts, cities, dams, and river channels. It shows where water moves. The invisible map shows who can absorb loss. That second map is harder to draw, but it matters more. Because when the Colorado River is cut, the damage does not stop at the canal gate. It moves through jobs, debt, food prices, housing, tribal sovereignty, public health, energy bills, ecosystems, and local economies. Start with agriculture. The Colorado River makes farming possible in some of the driest productive landscapes in North America. In places like the Imperial Valley and Yuma, irrigation turns desert into fields. Those fields can produce winter vegetables, hay, feed crops, and other agricultural products that move far beyond the basin. To someone flying overhead, it can look like a miracle, green rectangles under a brutal sun. But miracles have plumbing. They have rights. They have costs. When cuts arrive, a farm cannot simply use less in the way a household can take shorter showers. Irrigation water is tied to crop calendars, soil conditions, equipment, labor, markets, and financing. If a field is fallowed, that may save water, but it can also reduce income, affect farm workers, disrupt processors, weaken rural businesses, and change the tax base of a community. A field is not only a field, it is a local economy with roots. That does not mean agriculture can be exempt from change. It cannot. Agriculture uses most Colorado River water, and any serious basin-wide solution must address that scale. But it does mean the phrase, cut agriculture, hides human consequences. The person who loses income may not own the water right. The person who leaves town may not appear in the legal dispute. The person who absorbs the shock may not be invited to the negotiation table. That is one layer of vulnerability. Another layer is urban inequality. Large cities often have more tools than small communities. They can invest in water reuse, conservation programs, tiered pricing, leak detection, groundwater banking, desalination partnerships, public education, and long-term planning. They have engineers, lawyers, bond capacity, and political attention. Poorer neighborhoods and smaller towns have fewer buffers. A higher water bill may be annoying for a wealthy household. It can be destabilizing for a low-income family. A landscaping ban may be simple for a homeowner with savings. It may be a job loss for someone working in yard maintenance. A new infrastructure fee may be absorbed by a major city but painful for a rural district. Water scarcity often arrives dressed as policy. But policy lands as household stress. Then there are tribal nations. This is one of the most important and often least understood parts of the Colorado River story. Tribal water rights are not marginal, they are central. NARF says 22 tribal nations in the Colorado River Basin hold rights to use about 3.2 million acre-feet of Colorado River water annually, about 25% of the basin's average annual supply. That number should change how viewers understand the river. Tribal nations are not simply stakeholders. They are sovereign governments with major rights and deep histories. Many of those rights are senior. Many were ignored, delayed, underdeveloped, or left unresolved while states, cities, and irrigation districts built systems around water that tribes were not always able to fully use. This creates a painful paradox. A tribe can have a strong legal claim and still face water insecurity. A right on paper does not automatically build a treatment plant. It does not automatically install household plumbing. It does not automatically construct canals, pumping stations, storage facilities, or delivery systems. It does not automatically fund legal teams or engineering studies. It does not automatically repair generations of exclusion. That is why the Colorado River crisis cannot be told honestly without tribal infrastructure. The phrase, unused tribal water, can be deeply misleading. Water may be unused not because it is unnecessary, but because the infrastructure, funding, and legal settlement processes have not allowed full use. In a shortage, that distinction becomes explosive. Other users may see water as available. Tribes may see an unfulfilled right. Both the legal and moral stakes are enormous. The invisible map also crosses the border into Mexico. The Colorado River once reached a vast delta at the Gulf of California. Today, much of the river is consumed before it reaches the sea, except in managed releases and wet periods. Mexico has treaty rights and communities that depend on the river. The delta has ecosystems that remember water even when the channel is dry. A river does not stop being a river because humans divide it with borders. But legal systems often treat it as if it does. Then there is hydropower. When reservoirs full, dams can generate less electricity. Hoover Dam and Glen Canyon Dam do not simply hold water, they also produce power. Lower reservoir levels reduce hydraulic head, meaning the force of water pushing through turbines declines. If levels fall too far, power generation can become impossible at certain facilities. That affects utilities, revenue systems, and customers who may never connect their electricity bill to snowpack in the Rockies. This is how a water crisis becomes an energy issue, and energy issues become affordability issues, and affordability issues become political issues. The same pattern appears in ecosystems. Fish, riparian habitat, wetlands, and the river delta need water too, but ecological water needs are often last in political urgency because ecosystems do not vote, hire lobbyists, or threaten lawsuits in the same way states and districts do unless laws and advocates give them leverage. This is the core of vulnerability. The weakest parts of a system are often the least visible until failure begins. A canal break is visible. A reservoir ring is visible. A dry field is visible. But a delayed tribal water project, a farm worker's lost season, a household's rising bill, a shrinking wetland, a small town's declining tax base, or a young family deciding not to stay, these are slower losses. They rarely make the headline, yet they are the crisis. The proposed cuts are dangerous not only because of their size, but because of how they may pass through unequal capacity. A wealthy city can redesign, a senior water user can litigate, a major irrigation district can negotiate compensation, a small community may simply endure, a household may just pay, a worker may just leave, a tribe may continue waiting for infrastructure promised in principle but delayed in practice. That is why who gets cut first is not a technical question. It is a question about power, and power in the Colorado River Basin has history. For generations, federal policy encouraged settlement, irrigation, dam building, and growth, while tribal rights were often constrained or ignored. Cities expanded on imported water. Agriculture became embedded in law and economy. Real estate markets assumed long-term supply. The river was transformed into a development engine. Now that engine is overheating. The temptation in a crisis is to search for villains. Farmers wasting water, cities growing too fast, lawmakers delaying, golf courses in the desert, lawns in subdivisions, data centers, alfalfa exports, California, Arizona, the upper basin, the lower basin, the federal government. Some criticisms are valid, some uses deserve scrutiny, some crops, landscapes, and growth plans may not make sense in a hotter future. But a serious analysis has to go deeper than blame. The danger is structural. The system rewarded growth, then treated the water behind that growth as secure. It built incentives around use. It converted water into property value. It allowed legal rights and physical supply to drift apart. It postponed the hardest negotiations because reservoirs could absorb delay. Now the people least responsible for the original design may be among those least able to absorb the consequences. That is the moral weight of the Colorado River crisis. It is not simply that water is scarce. It is that scarcity reveals whose security was real and whose security was conditional. A homeowner may discover their city's future growth depends on water deals they never read. A farm worker may discover their livelihood depends on a legal priority they do not hold. A tribe may discover that even senior rights require expensive infrastructure to become lived reality. A small town may discover that decisions made in distant negotiation rooms determine whether its economy survives. A river delta may discover again that ecosystems are often the last claimant in a human shortage. This is why the 40% headline is not enough. The headline measures volume. It does not measure vulnerability. It does not tell us who has backup groundwater and who does not. It does not tell us which districts can pay for conservation and which cannot. It does not tell us which families are one bill away from crisis. It does not tell us which tribal communities are still waiting for safe and reliable water infrastructure. It does not tell us which rural economies depend on crops that might be fallowed. The real crisis is not a number. It is a distribution. In a stable system, distribution can be negotiated quietly. In a shrinking system, distribution becomes the main event. The Colorado River is forcing the West to confront a truth that many climate stories eventually reveal. Physical stress does not create inequality from nothing. It exposes the inequality already built into the system. The river is low. But the deeper question is, who stands at the bottom of the hierarchy when the water falls? The Colorado River is not only a river crisis. It is a preview of a broader problem. Modern systems built for one climate are being forced to operate in another. That is why this story matters, even if you live far from the American West. You do not need to drink Colorado River water to live inside the same pattern. Around the world, cities, farms, power grids, insurance systems, transportation networks, and legal codes were designed using old climate assumptions. They were built around historical averages, flood maps, snow records, reservoir yields, temperature ranges, fire seasons, crop calendars, and infrastructure lifespans. The assumption was not that nature never changed. The assumption was that change stayed within a manageable envelope. But climate change bends the envelope. In the Colorado River Basin, that bending is visible in snowpack, runoff, heat, reservoir levels, and the timing of water. In other places, it appears as coastal flooding, wildfire smoke, heat waves, collapsing insurance markets, overloaded storm drains, failing levees, stressed power grids, or crops blooming too early. The details differ. The pattern is the same. A system designed for the past starts receiving weather from the future. At first, the system adapts around the edges. It raises a seawall, it adds a cooling center, it upgrades a pump, it changes a reservoir rule, it pays for temporary conservation, it extends a boat ramp, it imports emergency power, it asks residents to reduce use. Then the events repeat. The temporary becomes routine. The routine becomes expensive. The expensive becomes political. The political becomes legal. The legal becomes unstable. That is the system story of the Colorado River. This is not simply a drought. It is a test of whether institutions can change before the physical world forces them to. The river connects at least 5 systems. First, water supply. This is the obvious one. Cities, farms, tribes, industries, and ecosystems need water. But water supply is not just gallons. It is timing, quality, pressure, treatment, delivery, storage, and legal access. A community does not have water in the abstract. It has a chain of dependence, and every link can break. Second, food. Agriculture uses much of the Colorado River. That means water cuts can affect crop choices, prices, rural employment, and national supply chains. Not every crop has the same value or the same water demand. Not every field has the same legal right. Not every farm has the same ability to change. A river shortage can move through grocery stores in ways consumers never trace back to a reservoir. Third, energy. Dams generate hydropower. Reservoir elevations affect how much power can be produced. Water operations can protect one reservoir while stressing another. If hydropower declines, utilities may need replacement energy. That can raise costs, change emissions, or stress grids during heat waves. Fourth, growth. Desert cities are not impossible, but they require planning discipline. The question is not whether people can live in dry places. People have always lived in dry places. The question is whether growth can continue under assumptions that no longer match the water system. New homes, new factories, new data centers, new lawns, new roads, new schools all require confidence in future water. If that confidence weakens, the economic model changes. Fifth, law. Law turns water into expectation. It tells investors, farmers, cities, and governments what they can count on. But law can also slow adaptation when rights are rigid, negotiations are adversarial, and political actors fear losing more by compromise than by delay. Together, these systems create the real risk. A water cut affects crops. Crop changes affect jobs. Job losses affect communities. Lower reservoirs affect power. Power changes affect costs. Higher costs affect households. Household stress affects politics. Politics affects negotiations. Negotiations affect reservoir rules. Reservoir rules affect future water. That is a loop, not a line. And loops can amplify. This is why the Colorado River crisis cannot be solved by telling ordinary people to care more. Individual conservation matters, but the scale is structural. A household can remove grass. A city can recycle wastewater. A farm can improve irrigation efficiency. A tribe can negotiate a settlement. A state can propose cuts. The federal government can revise operations. All of that matters. But without a Bayesian-wide framework that aligns use with supply, improvements can be swallowed by growth, legal conflict, or the next dry year. The central question is baseline. What is the new normal? That phrase is overused, but in water management it is deadly serious. A baseline is the assumed condition around which a system is designed. If the baseline is wrong, the system will keep misreading reality. If planners assume that a dry period is temporary, they will try to bridge it. If they assume the river has shifted, they will redesign around lower supply. Those are different strategies. Bridging asks, how do we survive until normal returns? Redesign asks, what if this is normal enough to plan around? The Colorado River Basin is stuck between those questions. No serious scientist says every year will be dry. There will still be wet years. There will still be snow. Reservoirs may recover temporarily. Floods can still happen in a warming climate. Variability remains. But variability around a hotter baseline is not the same as variability around an old baseline. That distinction matters. A wet year in a hotter world may refill part of a reservoir, but it may not restore the old long-term yield. A snowstorm after a warm winter may help, but it may not undo soil moisture deficits. A conservation deal through one deadline may prevent immediate collapse, but it may not solve long-term imbalance. The danger is mistaking relief for recovery. Systems do this often. After a heat wave, temperatures fall and people move on. After a flood, water recedes and rebuilding begins. After a wildfire, smoke clears and the landscape drops out of national attention. After a wet winter, reservoirs rise and political urgency fades. But climate risk accumulates between headlines. The Colorado River's reservoirs make accumulation visible. The bathtub rings are records of cumulative stress. They show that one year did not create the crisis, and one year will not erase it. That is why the new baseline question is so uncomfortable. It asks whether the West can stop planning around hope. Hope has a role, but hope is not a water policy. A resilient system would ask different questions. Which uses are essential? Which uses are flexible? Which rights are senior but underdeveloped? Which communities lack infrastructure? Which crops make sense under lower supply? Which cities can grow through reuse rather than new withdrawals? Which water savings are real and legally protected? Which reservoirs must be protected for power and delivery? Which ecosystems need minimum flows? Which agreements are temporary, and which actually change the long-term math? Those are not easy questions, but they are more honest than pretending the old river is coming back on schedule. The Colorado River also exposes a deeper cultural problem, the belief that engineering can always outrun limits. For much of modern history, the West's answer to scarcity was construction: build a dam, dig a canal, drill a well, pump from farther away, store more, move more, treat more, grow anyway. This produced extraordinary achievements. It also produced dependence on ever more complex systems. Complexity is not bad, but complexity requires maintenance, honesty, and margin. When the margin disappears, complexity becomes vulnerability. A small rural water system with one well is vulnerable because it lacks redundancy. A giant river basin with dams, compacts, canals, cities, tribes, farms, and international treaties is vulnerable because its redundancy can be consumed by political delay and physical decline. Both can fail. They fail differently, but they share a warning. Infrastructure is not just concrete. It is the relationship between concrete, climate, money, law, and trust. If trust breaks, every forecast becomes a negotiation. If law breaks, every shortage becomes a lawsuit. If infrastructure breaks, every promise becomes theoretical. If climate breaks the old range, every system built on that range becomes suspect. That is why the Colorado River is a system test. It tests whether states can cooperate when no one wants to lose water. It tests whether the federal government can impose or negotiate rules without triggering endless litigation. It tests whether cities can grow while using less. It tests whether agriculture can adapt without destroying rural communities. It tests whether tribal rights can be honored not only in legal language, but through infrastructure and water access. It tests whether hydropower can remain reliable as reservoirs full. It tests whether the public can understand that a crisis may be real even before taps run dry. That last test may be the hardest. People often recognize disaster only when it becomes visible in their own lives. Smoke in the lungs, water in the street, heat in the bedroom, fire on the ridge, empty shelves, a dry tap. But system failure begins earlier. It begins when the assumptions stop working. The Colorado River still flows. That is important. This is not a story about a dead river. It is a story about a river being asked to support a living system larger than its reliable supply. That difference matters because there is still agency. The future is not predetermined. The basin can conserve more. It can change crops. It can invest in tribal water infrastructure. It can pay for real reductions. It can reuse urban water. It can protect reservoir elevations. It can revise operating rules. It can limit growth that has no secure water. It can measure groundwater honestly. It can stop confusing paper water with wet water. But the longer adaptation is delayed, the more adaptation becomes crisis management. And crisis management is more expensive, more unequal, and more politically explosive than planned transition. That is the message hidden inside the 40% headline. The number is not only a warning about Arizona, California, and Nevada. It is a warning about any society that waits for physical limits to become undeniable before updating the rules that depend on them. Colorado River is not the exception. It may be the preview. A story this urgent needs discipline. Without discipline, it becomes panic, and panic is not the same as truth. So before reaching the end, we need to separate what is known, what is connected, what is uncertain, and what is exaggerated. First, what is real? The Colorado River Basin is under severe stress from long-term drought, warming, overuse, low reservoir storage, legal complexity, and stalled negotiations over future operating rules. Federal agencies are actively planning post-2026 operations for Lake Powell and Lake Mead. The Bureau of Reclamation has stated that long-term drought has reduced system storage to about 36% of capacity, and that low snowpack and extreme heat have elevated risks to essential water and power infrastructure. That is real. The proposed scale of cuts is also real as a planning concern. Reuters reported that the US government has proposed a plan that could cut up to 40% of current supplies to Arizona, California, and Nevada, with reductions up to 3 million acre-feet annually. That is real. but it must be stated carefully. It does not mean every household loses 40% of tap water immediately. It does not mean the same cut lands everywhere. It does not mean a single number tells the whole future. It means the scale of potential reduction being considered is enormous, and the distribution of that reduction depends on law, negotiation, hydrology, reservoir levels, and federal decisions. Second, what is connected? Climate change is connected to the crisis through warming, increased evaporation, lower runoff efficiency, and hotter drought conditions. Research has found that higher temperatures have already contributed to Colorado River flow losses during the 21st century drought. But connection is not the same as simplistic causation. It would be wrong to say every dry year is caused only by climate change. The Colorado River has always been variable. Natural droughts existed before industrial warming. Snowpack rises and falls. Weather still matters. But it would also be wrong to ignore the role of warming in making droughts more damaging and reducing runoff. The honest sentence is this: natural variability still operates, but it now operates in a warmer basin. That warmer basin changes the stakes. Third, what is often exaggerated? One exaggeration is that cities are about to run completely dry in the simplest, most cinematic sense. That is not the most likely immediate picture. Major cities have planning tools, reserves, legal arrangements, conservation programs, and infrastructure. Indoor municipal use is often more protected than outdoor or agricultural use. The risk is not usually one morning when every tap in Phoenix, Las Vegas, or Los Angeles stops. The risk is a grinding squeeze: higher costs, stricter rules, reduced growth flexibility, more conflict over supplies, emergency conservation, infrastructure stress, and harder trade-offs between cities, farms, tribes, energy, and ecosystems. Another exaggeration is that one villain caused the crisis. That is too easy. It is easy to blame farmers. Agriculture uses most of the water, and some crops deserve scrutiny in a hotter basin. But farmers operate inside legal rights, markets, federal policy, crop demand, debt, and infrastructure built over decades. It is easy to blame cities. Cities grew in deserts, sometimes aggressively, but many cities have also reduced per capita water use and invested heavily in conservation. It is easy to blame California because it has large senior rights. It is easy to blame Arizona because junior priority creates vulnerability. It is easy to blame the upper basin for not offering enough cuts, or the lower basin for using too much from reservoirs. There are valid criticisms in all directions. But a systems crisis is not solved by choosing one villain and stopping the analysis. The danger is not one false villain. The danger is a system where every actor can be rational and the total result can still become unstable. Fourth, what is uncertain? Future snowpack is uncertain. Future runoff is uncertain. Political agreements are uncertain. Court outcomes are uncertain. Federal decisions are uncertain. The speed of urban adaptation is uncertain. The willingness of agricultural users to conserve or shift crops is uncertain. The funding for tribal infrastructure is uncertain. The trajectory of groundwater use is uncertain. Uncertainty does not mean safety. It means range. And when a system is already strained, the lower end of the range becomes dangerous. Fifth, what is the real risk? The real risk is not that the Colorado River suddenly vanishes. The real risk is that the river becomes less reliable than the institutions built around it. That is a more precise fear. A less reliable river can still flow. It can still support cities. It can still irrigate crops. It can still produce power in some years. But if reliability declines, everything depending on reliability becomes more expensive and contested. Water rates rise. Insurance assumptions shift. Farm planning becomes harder. Reservoir operations become more defensive. Legal disputes intensify. Growth becomes conditional. Tribal rights become even more central. Emergency measures become normal. That is the real danger, not apocalypse, but permanent instability. And permanent instability is enough to change a region. This is why the script must avoid cheap fear. The facts are already serious. They do not need to be inflated. In fact, exaggeration weakens the story because it lets skeptics dismiss the real problem. The real problem is strong enough. A hotter, drier, overallocated river system is approaching a legal and operational reset. That reset may shape the Southwest for decades. That is not speculation. That is the story. Return to the image at the beginning. Lake Mead, pale rock, a high waterline far above the surface, a reservoir wall marked by absence. At first, it looks like a drought image. It looks like a lake that needs rain, snow, relief, a lucky year. But now it means something else. That ring on the rock is not only a record of missing water, it is a record of missing adaptation. It shows the distance between what the system expected and what the river delivered. It shows the gap between the legal river and the physical river. For a century, the West built confidence around the Colorado River. It built dams, canals, farms, cities, power systems, suburbs, and legal rights. It turned a wild and variable river into one of the most managed water systems on Earth. That achievement was real. So is the crisis. The Colorado River is not simply running short, it is revealing a deeper mismatch between old rules and new conditions. The reservoirs are lower, the snowpack is less reliable, heat is more punishing. The legal claims are rigid, the communities are unequal. The future is being negotiated under pressure from a physical system that cannot be persuaded by politics. But this story should not end in despair. There are tools, real tools. Cities can use less water without collapsing. Some already have. Wastewater can be reused, leaks can be repaired, non-functional grass can be removed, agriculture can be compensated for real conservation, crop choices can change, groundwater can be measured and governed more honestly, tribal water rights can be quantified, honored, and connected to infrastructure, reservoir rules can be rewritten for a hotter baseline, growth can be planned around water that actually exists, not water that looks convenient on paper. None of this is easy. But difficulty is not the same as impossibility. The harder truth is timing. A system can change by choice, or it can change by collision. Choice is slower, negotiated, imperfect, and politically painful. Collision is faster, harsher, and usually unfair. The Colorado River is now asking which path the West will take. The proposed cuts may change, the negotiations may shift, a wet year may temporarily raise the reservoirs, a new agreement may buy time, but the central message will remain. The river has exposed the weakness of a world built on old averages, and that world is not limited to the Southwest. Everywhere, infrastructure is meeting climate conditions it was not designed for. Everywhere, legal systems are being asked to govern physical realities that move faster than policy. Everywhere, old promises are being tested by new baselines. The Colorado River is not only asking who gets water next year, it is asking whether modern society can rewrite its rules before physical reality rewrites them for us.